Section 21 of Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Gauntz. Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward. Section 21. Pius VI. The next four quatrains refer to Rome and Pope Pius VI. Century 5, Quatrain 57, 199. Istra de Montgolfier et Aventine, qui par le trou advertira l'armée. Entre deux rots sera pris le butin, de sexte massol faillir le renommée. Translation. When a French army shall go from Montgolfier to the Aventine, there will be a man advising them from under the hole. The booty shall be seized between the two rocks, and the glory of the sixth celibate shall wither. This is a very curious stanza. The name of Montgolfier, the aeronaut, is visible enough in the two separate words Montgolfier. Monsieur Lepeltier calls it the grammatical figure of metaplasm, but it is not strictly so. Metaplasm is the forming of cases from a non-existent nominative. This is making two words for things non-existent to represent a proper name. But there is still a greater singularity in the employment of it here. For Nostradamus, as I understand him, makes this fictitious mountain contrast with the real Mount Aventine. He makes it stand, as I think, for one of the two rocks between which the booty is secured. The brothers Montgolfier were paper-makers at Annonay-Ardèche, and they gave their own name to their discovery, which dates June 5, 1783. Their balloons opened at the bottom to be filled, so that a man placed in them was under the hole, par le trou. I do not know at what point the Montgolfier was floated to furnish military information to the French, but I suppose on the Italian side of the Alps, so that from that rock or mountain to the Aventine rock would be the points between which the booty was seized. But the former of these Nostradamus seems to me to designate by the man's name, which lends itself to a play upon the word rather than by a peak of the Alps. Monsieur Lepeltier says that the two rocks refer to Peter, Pierre being rock. One is Avignon in France, and the other Rome in Italy, and the booty was obtained by the Treaty of Tolentino, under date of February 19, 1797. By this time the Pope lost Avignon and Venaissin in France, Bologna, Ferrara, and the Romagna in Italy, and this he calls the two rocks. The balloon was first used to reconnoiter the position of the Austrians at the Battle of Fleurus, June 16, 1794. Almost immediately after the treaty, the pontiff was dragged from Italy to die at Valence. Thus was fulfilled the prophecy of faillir le renommée. Interpret how you may, the mention of the name of Montgolfier so appropriately in this connection must always stand as proof of the most solid kind that Nostradamus's foresight was miraculous. Century 5, Quatrain 30, 1201. Tout alentour de la grande cité sera soldat logé par champs et villes. Donnez l'assaut périr Rome en cité. Sur le pont leur sera fait grand pile. Translation. Compassing all around the great city, there shall be soldiers camping in the fields and towns. A Frenchman, Paris will take Rome excited. There will then be perpetrated on the Pope a great pillage. The Executive Directory, in defiance of the Constitution which formerly forbade it, encamped troops around Paris, La Grande Cité, on September 4, 1797. This was to quell or keep in awe the counter-revolution. A Frenchman, Paris, General Berthier, took Rome by assault February 10, 1798, the pretext being that General Dufault had lost his life in an émeute dans Rome et Cité. Pope Pius VI was dispossessed of his states, arrested in his palace, and subjected to general pillage. Century 8, Quatrain 46, 1202. Paul Mansol mourut à 3 lieues de Rosne, fuit les deux prochains Tarsac destrois, car Mars fera le plus horrible toisne, de coq de l'aigle de France frère toi. Translation. The grand celibate shall die 3 leagues from the Rhone, the 2 dejected brothers shall fly tumult. For war shall make a most horrible throne, for the 3 brothers of France by the cock and eagle. The Pope, that is, shall die at Valence, a few leagues from the Rhone. The 2 brothers, afterwards Louis XVIII and Charles X, alarmed at the movement of the populace, take flight. War inflicts sad havoc on the throne of the three brothers, Louis XVI, Louis XVIII, and Charles X, by the Orleans cock and Napoleonic eagle. Century 2, Quatrain 99, 1-203. Terroir romain qu'interpretois ogre, par gens gallois par trop sera vexé. Mais nations celtiques craindre leur, boréa classe trop loin l'avoir poussé. Translation: The Roman territory that the Pope governed the French will cruelly vex, but that Celtic nation should fear the hour when it has advanced its army too far to the north. I render this in the main in accordance with Monsieur Lepeltier, but perhaps some may think that the Pope cannot be called an augur without great violence. Interpretois can hardly stand for spiritual government. It is also difficult to make classis into army. Classis represented the orders of the people of Rome, that divided them into bands and companies for governmental and electoral purposes, not for war. The only classis of war was the fleet, and Garcinier renders it by navy, although he is entirely abroad in every other respect in his interpretation of the Quatrain. Though he forces a fulfillment upon it in the time of Henry II of France, still evidently Rome is meant, whatever the augur may interpret. The Roman territory was twice trampled on by the French, first by General Berthier against Pius VI, and again by General Miollis, who in 1809 removed Pope Pius VII. The closing couplet is clearly a forecast of Napoleon's defeat in Russia. That will not be affected by the manner in which we interpret class, but I cannot imagine for a moment that Nostradamus would employ the Latin classis so erroneously for an army, which no Roman would ever use it for. Certimum classicum is a sea fight, but never employed for engagements on land. The result of this minute verbal inquiry will, I think, end by establishing the more remarkably the prescience and forecast of this consummate seer. He uses the word class in one of its late 18th or early 19th century exceptions, for that body of young men which is called out every year in France by lot to serve in the army, or all those called to the colours who are drawn for service in the same year. It is an administrative word that sprang into use out of the conscription, and which will die out again when that fraud passed upon the nations of Europe has been detected and abolished. That institution which fosters war and makes its otherwise intermittent evils permanent and perpetual upon humanity. To enlarge the area of this view is to doom conscription to death and sure oblivion. Conscription is an invention of Beelzebub when seeking his bath of blood under the euphonic guise of a patriotic defense of the mother soil. Mourir pour la patrie is the glozing lie of Roger de Lille that supplements or drowns the true cry of blood for Moloch. So we will read for the first time now the passage thus: But let the Celtic nation beware the hour when her conscript columns are pushed too far to the boreal northeast. In brief, beware of Moscow. If this 16th century anticipation of a 19th century idiom be nothing, then let the Alps be called a molehill, and the hollow sea a cup. Here we close the prefiguration of the papal torment appropriately enough. It closes with a terrible hint to its tormentor. End of section 21.
Section 22 of Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Botez. Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward. Napoleonic Rule, Part 1. Century 3, Quatrain 35. 1-205. Du plus profond de l'Occident d'Europe, de pauvres gens, un jeune enfant naîtra, que par sa langue séduira grand troupe, son bruit au reine, d'Orient plus croîtra. Translation. In the southern extremity of Western Europe, a child shall be born of poor parents, who by his tongue shall seduce the French army. His brood shall extend to the kingdom of the East. In the island of Corsica was born, of an ancient but impoverished family, a child, Napoleon Bonaparte, whose proclamations electrified the French troops. His expedition by order of the Directory to Egypt, which was meant to ruin his career, conferred upon him a worldwide renown. This man was not eloquent, as orators are eloquent. Verbosity is their gift. Even the endowment of Cicero lay much in words, and in their multitude, which wanteth not folly. Solomon says sin. A plethora of words becomes the apoplexy of reason. But this man's phrases are all portable, made for the knapsack. They fly to the lip as lightning does to metal. Poetry, passion, and energy are in them, but fused to an aerolite, till they fall like a luminous bolt, only to burn in man's memory forever after. They are not winged, but lightning-shod. Fulminants are matter etherealized to an interlinking with spirit, but this man's words are spirit itself, to burn their niche in time, to last as long as that will. Take 2 of them. Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. And again, behold the son of Austerlitz. When you speak, speak thus to men. Such words are deeds, and come not from one who beateth the air to the pitch-pipe of the Tibicen Ciceronical, but as the bullet to its butt. Speak sword points that press between the joints and marrow. But I will stop here to escape oratory. That may still fetch its price, and seduce the zebra troop in the courts of legal falsity, or in the bubble room down by the river Minister. Century 1, Quatrain 76, I 206. D'un homme farouche, tel proféré sera, que les 3 sœurs auront fato le nom. Plus grand peuple, par langue et fait dira, plus que nul autre, aura bruit et renom. Translation. Of a savage name there shall be such publishing, that the 3 sisters shall have by fate the same name. Then he will lead a great nation by tongue and deed, and have more glory and fame than any other. Here M. Le Pelletier takes le proféré for a thing placed before, and understands it as being the praenomen of Bonaparte vis-à-vis Napoleon. But I cannot see how that is shown to be the meaning of proféré. That word, if from the Latin profere, never was used for cognomen or praenomen. One of the meanings of profere is palam facere, to make public or publish, and I think it would be safer to render it as I have done. It will still equally draw attention to the name Napoleon, in contradistinction to the name Bonaparte, because when he mounted the throne as emperor, he adopted the new name and abandoned the previous one. This selection of a new name seems to be a natural instinct of humanity on entering upon a new phase of life. The popes take a new name on assuming the pontifical rank. Monks and nuns do so on entering the religious life. Commoners leave their names behind when created peers. Women do so when they marry, and here Napoleon does it. But I do not think it desirable to consider this to be indicated by the word profere. Nostradamus says that it is such a fatal name that the parquet themselves will adopt it. He then repeats that he will lead. I think it should be seduce, seduira, the Grande Nation by speech and deeds, and raise a name unrivaled in the universe. This was certainly true, and the prefiguration of it is, beyond the denial of prejudice, marvelous. We have now to deal with the word itself, which will furnish to investigation a few interesting hints. Of course, some may think them intricate and far-fetched. There is no great importance to be attached to them, perhaps, but they must interest the curious, and curiosity that is innocent has a value of its own. Who could see in Sloane's strange Chelsea gallery the shape, dimension, and value of the Museum of Bloomsbury and its affiliations? Century 9, Quatrain 33, I 208. Hercule Roy de Rome et Danemark, de Gaulle Trois Guillons surnomme, Tremblay l'Italie et l'un de Cinq-Marques, premier sur tout monarque renomme. Translation: Hercules, king of Rome and Denmark, surnamed the triple giant of France, shall make Italy tremble in the wave of Saint Mark, first in renown of all monarchs. There was a Celtic Hercules, fabled to draw men by their ears. Par lang effect il conduira, as we have just seen, so that this Hercules means the Napoleonic dynasty. As to King of Rome, Napoleon actually assumed that title, and later on he conferred it upon his son by Marie-Louise. In the Memorial de Sainte Helene, 1840, I-79, by Las Cases, it is said that during his consulate, somebody published a genealogy connecting his family with the ancient kings of the north. This Napoleon ridiculed in the public journals, stating that his nobility dated only from Montenotte or the 18th Brumaire. Things were not yet ripe for royal pretensions. The Bonaparte family in Italy can trace to the 13th century. One branch was settled at Treviso, the other at Florence, and both held an honorable position. A third was at Sarzana in Genoa. A Charles Bonaparte settled in Corsica in 1612, and lived in obscurity, says Le Pelletier, till this family of kings was born. Taine has discovered that the family was of Condottiere stock, and D'Estaing and Stendhal had before that both of them found Napoleon's character more analogous to that than to any other type known to them. Taine finds him to be a Sforza or a Malatesta born, belated by 3 centuries. He is as unscrupulous, searching, and ambitious as Machiavelli, and curiously enough, the only book he is known to have ever annotated profusely is Machiavelli's Prince, which was found in his baggage at Waterloo, and has since been published. And an intensely interesting book it is, enormously wicked and shrewd, but diabolically wise in the devil's gay antics. It is a scientific treatise on government without God in the world. Its moral axiom would seem to be that even murder should be directed by good sense in the hands of a craft master. In this respect, I think it is even superior to the clemency of Caesar. The prince evidently fascinated him deeply. He treats his author quite imperially, as Bentley or any other great critic might do, and points out condescendingly where the priest is but a theorist, and errs for want of knowledge, such as can only be gained from the practical handling of affairs by a man of the Napoleon caliber. I don't know that you can read so deep into the very spirit For I will not mention heart in the same breath with Napoleon, of the man of blood and brain, as you may by the pencil interlineations, by him jotted down in this his Italian vade mecum. From time to time, as he recurs to the book, enlarging in view from general to first consul, and from first consul to emperor, you seem to sit with him as in a magical cave, with terrible writings that come and go upon the wall before you, writings which are the words of this book, and are lit up with a lurid phosphorescence, the light of which emanates from his own putrescent brain. It is not historically true to say, as M. Le Pelletier does, that the family lived in obscurity in Corsica. The house at Ajaccio was the largest in the place, a palace even as compared with the other residences. The title of King of Rome was precious to Napoleon, as it enabled him to claim succession to the empire of Charlemagne. Although Garancière, in his interpretation, fails of attaching any individual fulfillment to the words, he is able from this title to say that whoever it belongs to will attain to the Roman Empire. Guillaume is equivalent to Terraphilius or Earthborn, and means giant. In fact, it almost seems a variant of Géant. But why 3 giants of France? I do not know that this has ever been explained. Hercules, mythologically, was distinguished by 3 symbols: Martini, etymologicon, SV Hercules, a lion's skin, key, and 3 apples. The 3 apples were not to get angry, not to love money, not to love pleasure. This need only to be mentioned for the sake of the double triplication, and as marking so far the propriety of the term Hercules. Master of Rome, i.e. Italy, of Venice, i.e. Austria, of Paris, i.e. France, as ruled over by Napoleon as general, consul, emperor, that he was the first of monarchs over all renowned, needs no elucidation. Century 8, Quatrain 61, I 209. Jamais par le découvrement de jour ne parviendra au signe septrifère, que tout ce siège ne soyant en séjour, portant au coq d'un du tag armifère. Translation: Never shall he in broad daylight reach to the symbol of scepter-bearing rule. Of all his positions none will be of a settled permanency, conferring on the Gallic cock a gift of the armed legion. In other words, the emperor will never enjoy a settled seat of firmly established government, and he will confer upon France either the ruinous legacy or bequest, or gift of the legionary conscription, which converts Europe into an armed camp. An evil gift indeed. Or those who prefer it may render it as the gift to France of a huge burial place in Spain and Portugal, where so many thousands of men, her best blood, fell. But conscription is of the wider issue, and the more permanent evil, as it affects Europe to this hour. It makes peace an interlude to war, and very little less costly than war. Our next quatrain is a great rarity, for it seems to be in pure Provençal, and extremely pleasing it is, a great deal more honeyed to the ear, in sound, than the present French language, which is excellent for conversation and the salon, where the society grimaces, but where true souls are struck dumb, and poetry has ceased to be possible, or only possible to rebellion such as that of Victor Hugo. Century 4, Quatrain 26, I to 11. Lo grandes âmes se levera da bellos, que non sauran donde sieguen vengudos, de nuesh lambusc, lugash de su letreio, ciudad trajido per cinc langos non nudos. Translation: The great swarm of bees shall rise, that none can tell from whence they came. Night's ambush, the jay beneath the tiles, city betrayed by 5 tongues not naked. The bees stand for the Bonapartist army and the empire. The second line is understood by M. Lepelletier to refer to the origin of the family, and it may be so. But I think it refers to the surprising suddenness with which the rogues, sans-culottes, and republicans, in pretended love with equality and freedom, were found to welcome tyranny and rule of one, that used to be spoken of as monarchy. Guillotined in that form, Frenchmen hailed it as a sword savior in the new dictator. It seems to me to be the sudden conversion of such opposed principles to Bonapartism on the night of the 18th Brumaire, November 9, 1799. De Neuf Lambusque, an ambuscade of night, that startles Nostradamus. Certainly there was no doubt whatever whence the Napoleon family sprung, a family with a history more or less traceable for 500 years, can scarcely be described with propriety as one whose origin is lost in the night of time. Yet this is the meaning M. Lepelletier would have us put upon it. Next, like the jay in the fable, tricked out in peacock feathers, and spoils of the Capetian kings, Napoleon makes their palace of the Tuileries, Trelos, his headquarters. The city is given over to him by cinq langos, 5 prodigious talkers of the long robe. Far from naked as to words or clothing were they, but as to principles very nude and bare, quite unable to cope face to face with the audacity of this unscrupulous cutthroat, this gunner of Ajaccio. The men of no principles and no practice were simply ciphers before this man of practice, par langue effect, this ethnic Hercules of tongue and sword, this servant, as Daniel has it, of the god of forces, this fly-pest, Beelzebub, man of vepre et mouche, grown to a dynamic king. Where men have lost their virtue, the poor skeptics are given over to believe a lie of their own making. Tongues have they to lie withal, but never a hand amongst them to furnish help at need. Century 7, Quatrain 13, I 213. De la cité marine et tributaire, la testerasse prendra la satrapie. Chasseur sordide, qui puis sera contraire, par 14 en tiendra la tyrannie. Translation: The short-haired man shall assume authority, in maritime Toulon, tributary to the enemy. He will afterwards dismiss as sordid all who oppose him, and for 14 years direct the tyranny. The English had seized Toulon in the name of Louis XVII, and held it a few months till Bonaparte retook it. He overturned the Directory, sordid, and suppressed its partisans with the Republic, and enjoyed the tyranny for 14 years, from 18th Brumaire, November 9, 1799, to April 13, 1814. We have already seen on page 272 that the Cité Marine is too long. Garancière fancies this to have been fulfilled when Richelieu made himself governor of Havre de Grace, where he kept his treasure and tyrannized for about 14 years. Century 8, Quatrain 57, I 214. Des soldats simples parviendra en empire, des robes courtes parviendra à la longue, vaillant aux armes, en église au plus pire. Vexer le preste, comme le fait l'esponge. Translation. From a simple soldier he will rise to the empire. From the short robe he will attain the long. Able in arms, in church government he shows less skill. He raises or depresses the priests as water a sponge. This is a very remarkable quatrain that Bouy and Lepelletier and I suppose all French commentators pronounce to belong to Napoleon, and it certainly fits him very well, but with almost as little injury to historical fact. It may be applied to Cromwell, and accordingly Garancière does so apply it. He writes, I never knew nor heard of anybody to whom this stanza might be applied, than to the late usurper Cromwell, for from a simple soldier he became to be Lord Protector, and from a student in the university he became a graduate in Oxford. He was valiant in arms, and the worst churchman that could be found. As for vexing the priests, I mean the prelatical clergy, I believe none went beyond him. The circumstances of the French Revolution and the English Commonwealth times are so much alike in many respects that it is not surprising that such a description as this of a soldier who seized power and afflicted the clergy should fit both the usurpers, Napoleon and Cromwell, almost equally well. Napoleon was a plain lieutenant in 1785, consul for life in 1799, and emperor from 1804 to 1814. He changed the short robe for the long, is understood by M. Lepelletier as being the consular robe for the imperial. There is no need to interpret thus. The military dress or that of the civilian is the short robe. Nostradamus takes but little heed, so far as we have yet seen, of the consular dignity. In the last quatrain he designates the duration of the tyranny, not as one of 10 years which would represent the empire, but of 14, which regards the consulship and empire as one period. If we take Cromwell's protectorate, however, from the death of Charles I to the death of Cromwell, the term will correspond with Napoleon's imperial career, but the interregnum in England was a period of 12 years, and that in France under Napoleon was of 14, 14 ans. Hence this quatrain must not be applied to Cromwell, though it in other respects is as true of him as of Napoleon. Valiant in arms, but in ecclesiastical matters less successful. Still he thoroughly vexes them, penetrating into every place and corner, as water does into a sponge. We cannot accept M. Lepelletier's rendering of vexare as a meaning to raise and cast down. It was used in the sense of to trouble, cruciare, to anger, commovere, or to harass with care, curarum est to fluctuare, but never to alternately swell and depress, as in filling or squeezing out a sponge. Century 2, Quatrain 69, I-215. L'héroï gaulois par la celtique dextre, voyant discorde de la grande monarchie, sur les trois parts, fera fleurir son sceptre, contre la cape de la grande hiérarchie. Translation: The Gallic king, by means of the Celtic sword hand, seeing the discord of the great monarchy, shall make his sceptre flourish, by restoring the three parts, as against the capets and the popedom. Garancier understands as the cap of the great hierarchy, Spain in the Netherlands, which was the great upholder of the popedom. His application of this to history is of no value. But if we understand cap as capet, and the ancient connection of the French crown with the papal hierarchy, I think we elicit a better sense than that of M. Lepelletier, which makes the capet in the hierarchy one. The three parts restored, M. Lepelletier makes to consist of clergy, nobility, and tiers état. I feel that the three parts under Napoleon were Emperor, Senate, and Chamber of Deputies, which would be head or caput instead of capet, Senate representing the higher classes, and the chambers the people. That would constitute les trois parts of the Quatrain. Century 1, Quatrain 88, I-216. Le divin mal surprendra les grands princes. Un peu de vin aura femme espousée. Son appui et crédit à un coup viendra mince, quand celle mourra pour la teste rasée. Translation: He shall have married a woman just before the divine wrath falleth on the great prince, and his support shall dwindle in a sudden atrophy. Counsel shall perish from this shaven head. This divine evil that surprises the prince a little after his marriage with Marie Louise of Austria, and his mean-spirited repudiation of Josephine, is most excellently rendered by Garancier as the falling sickness, called by the Greeks epilepsia, and by the Latins morbus sacer. Garancier was a fellow of the London College of Physicians, and a man versed in the medical nomenclature of the day, so that le mal divin should here be rendered epilepsy. It has never yet been so rendered except by Garancier, and he has no application to make of it whatever, though as a mere matter of translation he says, "The construction of the whole is easy." It strikes me that this forecast, thus interpreted, will throw light from Nostradamus on what history has heretofore overlooked, and will necessitate the rewriting of Napoleon's life from the date of his wicked prostitution of the marriage rite. Napoleon, Cromwell, Mahomet, Caesar were all epileptic, and probably Alexander. But this particular scoundrel first committed, from the purely sordid motive of self-aggrandizement, a moral crime, and that brought on the convulsion of the brain, that practically discharged forever the mighty Leyden jar, or electric battery, with which this potent brain fiend had dealt out merciless torpedo shocks to Europe, and death as from the hot wind Samiel. Inflated vanity, the epileptic stroke, the reaction of external forces on the weakened center, made the cerebral pap, still of gigantic power, entertain new phantasms huger than ever, with a terribly diminished power of reason, to bring them to birth by the practical handling of circumjacent facts and time tendencies. Now, said the fool of this western parable, now am I master of events, and may swim against the sea, not with it, as I and common mortals heretofore have done, but against it, and to win. Well, he did carry the big dream into Russia, and as far as the nightmare of Borodino. He also still found a mighty utterance of lurid glory, with which to pin that evil minute in letters of fire and phosphorus upon the curtain of eternity. Behold the son of Austerlitz, the looming mot d'ordre, the old work, the old guards, and the old drillings, guided once again to a Pyrrhic victory. Two such will damn a kingdom. Reader, read Ségur, Comte de Ségur, Napoléon et la Grande Armée, page 179, and there perceive the giant unbrained and driveling about his bastard boy called King of Rome, and what else belongs to Mon étoile effacée. All the supports dwindle, says Nostradamus, and counsel will perish from the shaven head. Garancière is right and the diagnosis true. It is the falling sickness. It is not Jove fulminant that strikes the reeling pagod from without, as with Caesar 'twas, but an epileptic withdrawal of electricity from within, backwards. Emperor and empire will soon roll together in the dust. Man's posthumous analysis, and that of all the evil works wrought by him, though the good live after. Century 1, Quatrain 4, I 127. Par l'univers sera faite un monarque, quand paix et vie ne sera longuement. Lors se perdra la piscature barque, sera régie en plus grand détriment. Translation. Throughout the universe a monarch shall arise, who will not be long in peace nor life. The bark of St. Peter will then lose itself, being directed to its greatest detriment. The Emperor Napoleon, reviving pretensions to the old Roman Empire or universe, will neither enjoy peace nor life for very long. In his time the Holy Seat, La Piscature barque, shall so guide itself to greatest detriment as to be cast away and lost, under Pius VII. Pope Pius was made a prisoner by General Meaulis, July 6, 1809, and carried to Savone, then to Fontainebleau, and kept under strict guard by Napoleon till March 10, 1814, when he was set at liberty. Garancière interprets this as being fulfilled in the time of Henry II of France, who was slain by Montgomery in the tilt yard. Through all his reign he was at war with the Emperor Charles V. This emperor sacked Rome, and Pope Clement VII was made a prisoner. Vide Garancière, Tiber, page 77. Century 5, Quatrain 60, I 218. Par teste race viendra bien maleslière, plus que sa charge ne porte passera, si grande fureur et rage fera dire, que feu et sang tout sexe tranchera. Translation. In the shorn head France will have made so bad a choice, it will be heavier than its force will enable it to endure. So great fury and rage will make men say that he will exterminate the male sex by fire and sword. The period of the fulfillment of this event, M. Le Pelletier gives us extending from 1813 to 1815. It asks no further interpretation than that afforded by the translation. Century 4, Quatrain 82, I 219. À ma s'approche venant de Sclavonie, le lestin vieux cité ruinera, forte désolée verra sa Romanie, plus grande flamme estendre n'escora. Translation. A troop approaches, coming through Sclavonia. The destroyer will ruin an old city. He will see all Romania desolated, nor will he know how to extinguish such a blaze. A mass of troops is wending from Sclavonia. The destroyer, Napoleon, will ruin old Moscow altogether and see Romania desolated. Such a conflagration he will not know how to extinguish. It was Rostopchin, in 1812, fired Moscow to prevent the French from wintering there, and it settled the fate of the campaign. Century 2, Quatrain 44, I 220. L'aigle poussait un tour de pavillon, par autre oiseau d'un tour sera chassé, quand bruit de sombres tubes et son haillon rendront le sens de la dame insensée. Translation. The eagle, drifting in her cloud of flags, by other circling birds is beaten home, till war's hoarse trumpet and the clarion shrill recall her senses to the insensate dame. This is one of the few quatrains that lend themselves freely to a poetic rendering. The Napoleonic eagle driven back to France, with all its retreating flags about it, or chased by a surrounding of other eagles, Austrian, Russian, Prussian. The din of cymbals, trumpets, and clarions restore France to reason, the insensate dame. Garencier's annotation here is extremely funny, and should not be unrecorded. He says it is an eagle driven from the tents by other birds, when a mad lady shall recover her senses by the noise of cymbals, trumpets, and bells. Century 10, Quatrain 86, I 221. Comme un griffon viendra l'héros d'Europe, accompagné de ceux d'Aquilon, des rouges et blancs conduira grand troupe, et y rencontrer l'héros de Babylon. Translation. Like a griffin, the king of Europe will come, accompanied with those of the north. Of red and white there will be a great number, and they will go against the king of Babylon. Recording by Mike Botez.
Section 23, Part 2 of the Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward. Section 23, Part 2, page 305. The King of Europe is Louis XVIII. Shall come like a griffin. Griffin, a fabulous animal with hooked beak, Liddell and Scott, voir Griff, Noel, Griffo, Roquefort, Littré, Gwillem, Brunet, etc., accompanied with those of the north. He will conduct grand battalions of red and white uniforms, i.e., English and Austrian, and they will march as one against the king of Babylon, which is Paris. Louis, as the descendant of Hugh Capet, may be styled the first of European kings. The king of Paris is Napoleon, who ruled the revolution there and brought order to confusion or Babel. But we can bring it home to Paris even more intimately than this, for the old name of Paris was Lutetia, or mud place, where the toads, crapauds, or Frankish frogs, dwelt, and out of whose mud, or bourbe, came the Bourbon family. So that Paris, their chief city, en calembour, yields Bourbeville, Babel. Garancière thinks to see Gustavus Adolphus here as the most eminent king of Europe in his day, and he came from Aquilon, the north, and warred upon the emperor, who was king of Babylon, from propping the popedom, or from the Babel of confusion. He had regiments, red, white, and blue, and yellow and green, in the hope of creating emulation amongst them. If he had only had regiments red and white, we might have hesitated and gone further to examine where the clue would lead to. But what begins by proving too much is like other overshooting, and misses the mark entirely. Century 6, Quatrain 89, 1.222. Entre deux cymbes, pieds et mains attachés, de miel face ointe et de lait substanté, guêpe et mouche fitine, amour fâché, poxillateur, faussé, sif, tenté. We have now rather laboriously cleared the way for a translation. Between two prisons, bound hand and foot, with his face anointed with honey and fed with milk, exposed to wasps and flies and tormented with the love of his child, his cup-bearer will false the cup that aims at suicide. Notes on the Quatrain. The word for cymbe is a cup, usually, in Greek. Monsieur Le Pelletier gives the Greek word as a capacity, as a cavity, or precipice. I find no such meaning as precipice. There is a great difficulty to settle the meaning here. The Greek word means a cup, a boat, a wallet, and also is like the head. We should perhaps simplify the issue by confining ourselves strictly to the Latin word, samba, which is a boat or skiff, always a light boat, as in the Georgics, 136, where the little boats were made of alnos cavatas, the riverside alders, hollowed out. It is rather a craft for a small lake than for the sea, as Ovid charmingly puts it, non ideo debet per lago se credere, signa audet in exiguo ludere simba lacu. But then, what sense would it yield? A man being between two boats, tied hand and foot? Between two abysses, Monsieur Le Pelletier interprets. But then we do not find that either in Greek or Latin the word yields that meaning. He interprets it of Elba and St. Helena. But was an island ever called an abyss? I think as seldom as ever the Greek word meant one. Hesius gives the Greek word a hollow recess, the penetralia of the women's apartments, and he adds also Greek word the depth of the sea to explain Simba. In Martinius's Lexicon Etymologique there is a very curious quotation from Isidore, Book 19, which makes the Simba to be the space occupied by a ship in the displacement of the water beneath it. I think out of all this we may extract a meaning for the deux cymbes. As two places or recessed prisons hollowed out of the sea, he shall be put, bound hand and foot. The line, to scan correctly, would have the word "et" left out. Note on Fitine, the plant, a scion, a child. Note on Postillateur is cupbearer. Faussé is fausser, to trick. Siphus is cup. There is a singular appropriateness in this word, whether intended or not by Nostradamus, for Athenaeus describes the Betians as first using huge silver drinking cups, or siphi, which were denominated Herculean because Hercules, who was very fond of feasting, used such, and first invented the cry of "no heel taps." Ut lebantes nihil in calice vini relinquerent. The reader will bear in mind the Hercule de Gaulle of a former quatrain. End of notes. Page 308. Monsieur Le Pelletier renders this: Napoleon, after being consecrated by Pius VII and anointed from the sacred ampulla with honey and milk, underwent a double imprisonment in Elba and St. Helena. The imperial bees, for so he translates the wasps and flies, are desolated as to their love for the child, and his surgeon, Ivan Posilator, has falsified the death by poison on the night of April 12th to 13th, 1814. Now, as it was not his own soldiers that tormented him, I think we ought to read it fâché. He was desolated by wasps, flies, his child, and love. His soldiers are called abeilles before, never guêpes. These are the enemy tormenting, who will not let him abdicate in favor of his son. Greek word. We shall do better here to follow Garancier's example, drawn from the life of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. The Persians used to punish poisoners by laying them between two troughs, here called boats, with their face uncovered, bedaubed with honey to attract the wasps and flies, and fed them with milk to prolong the torment, which, if they refused, they ran needles into their eyes most persuasively, and then left them till vermin ate them up. So that it means he was tormented between two prisons bodily and mentally, with the ruin of his family, insomuch that he would have been glad to have escaped it all by poison. Whenever Napoleon was thoroughly frustrated in his plans, he evidently tried to fall back upon what he had never deserved, human sympathy, which in prosperity he had never thought of nor desired. He first showed this softening, rather the brain than heart, at Borodino, as we have said before. We will now take the substance of what happened at the abdication, as given by Monsieur Le Pelletier from the Manuscrit de 1814 by the Baron Fin. He abdicated, here we may say, woe unto him that buildeth a town with blood, Habakkuk 2:12, at Fontainebleau, April 4th, 1814, reserving the regency for the Empress Marie-Louise and his son. He was thrown into despair when he found the Allies to be masters of Paris, and to reject any such conditions. Baron Fin was his private secretary, and describes what occurred on the night of the 12th and 13th of April, before the day of his unconditional abdication. Fontainebleau really became a prison under the surveillance of strangers. There were no terms left to him to save even his life. Still, he let the day close without yielding. For some days previously he had seemed altogether preoccupied in revolving some design. His conversation turned always upon the voluntary death that the great men of antiquity courted when in situations such as his. The Empress had reached Orleans on her way to join him, but he had given orders not to allow her to do so. He dreaded such an interview as likely to unman him for the resolution he meditated. It was a terrible night of suspense. The long corridors of the palace resounded with the footsteps of servants going and coming. The candles were burning in the private apartments. Dr. Ivan is suddenly called upon to attend. The Duc de Vincennes is called for, and they hurry to fetch the Duc de Bassano from the chancellery. They are all taken to the bedroom as they drop in one after another. Sobs and sighs escape, but not a word is yet dropped to satisfy curiosity. On a sudden, the doctor leaves the apartment, descends to the courtyard, finds a horse ready saddled, and quits the place at a hand gallop. All that transpires on the occasion is that at the retreat from Moscow, Napoleon had provided himself with the means of escape, should he fall alive into the hands of the enemy. Ivan, his surgeon, had given him a packet of opium, which he had ever since carried round his neck. The valet heard him rise in the night, and saw through the half-open door that he mixed something in a glass of water, drank it off, and returned to bed. He quickly felt that his end was approaching, and had his most trusted followers called to his bedside, Ivan among the rest. But when he heard Napoleon complain that the action of the poison was too slow, he precipitately quitted Fontainebleau, as we have seen. A very heavy slumber supervened, accompanied with profuse perspiration, and when he awoke the symptoms had disappeared, the dose having proved of insufficient quantity, or time had deprived it of its efficacy. Napoleon, astonished at the failure, simply exclaimed, "Dieu ne le veut pas," and professing, perhaps for the first time in his life, to yield to Providence, resigned himself quietly to his new destiny. On board the Northumberland he strongly reprobated suicide. It would have been instructive to have heard the arguments employed by this intellectual giant, merely as a mental acrobat exhibiting, and as showing how far the intellect may be effective in illustrating the path of duty. But on nothing could Napoleon's opinion be worth so little as on the question of morals, where the soul's instinct is chief guide. The rats ate his heart, it is said in an interim of the medical dissection. I doubt it. He had eaten it himself long before he left Brienne. On the morning of the 13th, Napoleon rose and dressed as usual. His objections had vanished, and his next act was to ratify the treaty, a solemn act which he took the earliest opportunity that offered to betray and break. Century 10, Quatrain 24, 1-27. Le captif prince aux Itales vaincus passera Gênes par mer jusqu'à Marseille, par grand effort des forains survaincus, sauf coup de feu, baril, liqueur d'abeille. Translation. The captive prince conquered is sent to Elba. He will sail across the Gulf of Genoa to Marseille. By a great effort of the foreign forces he is overcome. Though he escapes the fire, his bees yield blood by the barrel. Notes on the translation. Itale is Italia, Elba. Par mer, the Gulf of Genoa. Forain, Latin, foris, for strangers. Sauf, Latin, sabus, English, safe. Sauf deux, coup de feu. He ran the blockade March 1, 1815, and landed at Cannes, close to Marseille, crossing the Gulf of Genoa, till defeated at Waterloo on the 18th of June, seeking death, says Le Pelletier, without being able to find it. Où il sera sauf de coup de feu. When the smoke rises from the bottomless pit, shall men seek death and not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. Revelations 9:6. Napoleon comes out of the island Aethalia, or metallic smoke, and escapes the murderous artillery that kills his men, though it were far fitter he should die. His beehive is not burned with fire, but other liquor than honey flows freely, the lifeblood of his bees. Century 2, Quatrain 70. Le dard du ciel fera son estendu, mort en parlant, grande exécution. La pierre en l'arbre, la fière Jean rendue, bruit humain monstre, purge, expiation. The third and fourth lines will neither of them scan. La fière Jean should be written La fière Jean, fière being read as one syllable. Bruit in the fourth line is to be read as one syllable. Garancière has breit, which, though it have no meaning, shows perhaps that it was one syllable. The translation. The thunderbolt shall strike his standard. He shall die speaking proud words. Great is the execution. The stone is in the tree. The proud nation yields. The monster purges his human fame by expiation. Notes on the translation. Le dard du ciel is the thunderbolt. Latin, ferire, to strike. Estendu is standard. Latin gens, nation. Latin monstrum, prodigy. Mort should be read meur, perhaps as referring to Napoleon, who showed great delight, it is said, when he found that Wellington intended to fight him. It cannot refer, as Lepelletier would have it to do, to the celebrated mot of Cambronne or General Michel, as it has been proved that it was never uttered at all, but manufactured by a wit après coup. The stone is in the tree. Lepelletier would here understand silex, the flint axe of primitive ages. This seems to me to be very far-fetched, and I would rather read with Garancière the stone into thunderstone, or aerolite, which seems to be far less forced. End of notes. The thunderbolt from heaven shall strike down his standard, and he fails or dies, uttering haughty words. There is terrible execution done. The stone is in the tree. The proud nation yields. The hero purges by expiation his human renown. In spite of all these doubts interposed, this yields us a quatrain of a sufficiently clear sense, in conveying two leading ideas: a providential and mighty overthrow of a giant leader, and braggart of swelling words, and of a proud nation split in battle, as a tree is by thunderstroke. The forcible picture is not unworthy of Waterloo or the Battle of Mont Saint-Jean, as the French call it, even though it may not be impossible to find some other battle since the death of Nostradamus that it might represent almost as well, if not quite so fully, as the tremendous day of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Englishmen seem half afraid now to mention the day with pride, for fear of hurting French susceptibilities. To mention it insultingly or in a hostile spirit is unpardonable, but to speak of it modestly and thankfully, and of Wellington as a great soldier and benefactor to us, is only manly and proper. The man who has not the courage to do this firmly and inoffensively in the company of Frenchmen is only one of the many cowards amongst us, who lead the French to think that however great things our fathers may have done in the past, the spirit has fled from us that would repeat them in the future. Century 9, Quatrain 86, 1-30. Du bourg, la reine parviendront droit à Chartres, et feront près du pont Antony pause. Sept pour la paix cauteleux comme martres, feront entrer d'armée à Paris close. Translation. From Bourg-la-Reine they shall march on Chartres. They shall camp close to Pont Antony. 7 chiefs for peace, cautious as martins, shall enter Paris, cut off from its army. The generals of the 7 nations coalesced, shall under pretext of peace, but really out of jealousy of France, says M. Lepelletier, and in virtue of the capitulation of the 3rd of July, enter Paris, now cut off from her army, clos d'armée, which retreats upon Chartres, passing by Bourg-la-Reine and Pont d'Antony, where it camps. The quatrain does not at all obviously read so, but we must suppose that it is the French army which goes to Chartres. We are not, however, bound to believe that the Martin-like and cunning 7 only pretend to establish peace out of jealousy to France. All Europe and France herself sighed for peace, and if, when victorious, the enemies were inclined to take back what France had robbed them of severally, that would not be very wonderful. The 7 nations signatory to the treaties of 1815 were England, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Portugal. This is a very remarkable forecast, and shows that although Nostradamus is a national prophet of France, and nearly all his 1,000 quatrains turn upon her and her interests, he seldom exhibits a particle of partisanship, and you would not know he was a Frenchman from any word that he lets fall. He strictly limits himself to the utterance of his vision in the tersest phrase, and the most forcible words that he can bring to bear for that purpose. I think there is no other instance known of such inviolable temperance. A man sits down in his study and prophecies, commits his visions to paper in prose, turns them deliberately afterwards and in cold blood into the pithiest poetry he knows how, shakes up in a hat, as we've previously remarked, all the quatrains together, and when he has effectually destroyed all sequence and order, counts them out into even hundreds, then without a word of note or comment, he sends them forth in type into the world to sink or swim, be ridiculed or admired, be understood or mistaken, perish or endure, until such period as their fulfillment in the centuries of time is realized, and the sleeping world awakens to the miracle that has slept also, beside the sleeping world, till light arose to make both clear at once. Century 2, Quatrain 67, 1-232. Le blond au nez fourche viendra commettre par la duel et chassera dehors. Les exilés dedans fera remettre aux lieux marins commettants les plus forts. Notes on the quatrain. Fourche is fourchu or forked, from Latin furca or hooked. Commettre, ellipsis for se commettre, to come to blows with anyone. Latin per or through or by means of. Latin duo, a second repetition. Consigning. Plus fort, read plus fort, stronger. Translation. The light-haired one will come to blows with the hooked nose for the second time and chase him out. The exiled will replace him within, consigning the strongest of the party to a fortress in the sea. Louis XVIII is designated Le Blond au nez fourchu, according to Le Pelletier. Le Blond is, no doubt, the sign of the Capets, as shown by several other stanzas in Nostradamus, but not the aquiline nose, I think. That, I believe, is intended for Napoleon. So that Louis XVIII comes to blows with the hooked nose, or Napoleon, for the second time and drives him out. He who was exiled before now replacing him within. The strongest, that is Napoleon and his officers, are committed aux lieux marins, which either means to the English, who go down to the sea in ships, or else to St. Helena, a prison in the sea. Century 10, Quatrain 90, 1-233. 100 fois mourra le tyran inhumain, mis à son lieu savant et debonair. Tout le Sénat sera dessous sa main, fâché sera par malin téméraire, where malin comes from malignus, Latin, for a criminal. Translation. The inhuman tyrant shall die 100 times, a learned and debonair king shall take his place. All the Senate shall be under his control, and he shall be grieved by a bold criminal. Napoleon is the inhuman tyrant to die 100 deaths, one his suicidal attempt, another Elba, with its cinerary and fuliginous ashes, another Waterloo, and lastly St. Helena, with its 10 times 10 remorseful hours, regrets, and studious falsifications of the history of his life. Debonair is, with Nostradamus, an epithet of the Capet family, and stands doubtless for Louis XVIII put into his place. The king finds the Senate quite submissive to his will, but he's cut to the heart by the daring attempt of the criminal Louvel upon the Duc de Berry, February 13, 1820. This is the excellent interpretation of M. Le Pelletier. Boys, page 80, writing in 1806 under the full influence of the demon of Napoleon, gives it a very different reading. The inhuman tyrant with him can be nobody but Robespierre, who, with a pistol shot, endeavored to put an end to himself ineffectually, but blew away half his face, suffering 30 hours of fearful torment, and finally was dragged to the place of execution amidst the maledictions of the populace. The savant et debonair to Boys is, of course, Napoleon. The malin téméraire is a forgotten Georges, whose conspiracy gave a little momentary anxiety to Napoleon. Here terminate the oracles assigned to Napoleon by M. Le Pelletier. But Boys adduces several others, which sufficiently relate to the emperor to be enumerated here. It is painful to see how men manipulate these things to suit their theories. We will give now a quatrain that Boyce cites, as he thinks it favorable to Napoleon. But he carefully omits the next one to it in the same century, purely, as it seems, because it's unfavorable to Napoleon. Quatrain 29, Boyce, 82. L'Oriental sortira de son siège, passer les monts Apennins, voir la Gaule, transpercera le ciel, les eaux et neiges, et un chacun frappera de sa Gaule. Translation. The Oriental will quit his post, to cross the Apennines and see after Gaul. He will transfix the heaven, the mountain ice and snows, striking each of them with his magic wand. The Oriental, i.e. Napoleon in Egypt, will leave his army behind there, after almost turning Mahometan, return and cross the Apennines and Alps to look after the Directory and their doings in France. He will soon even subdue the elements and nature by his marvelous roads over the mountains of ice and snow, and will strike each as with the rod of Moses or the wand of a magician, for the archaic and unusual word Gaule may mean that as well as a riding switch. Boyce misses the plainer meaning of the first line, but is determined it shall represent Napoleon, so he takes Oriental to be Corsica, as being east of Toulon. The passage of Mont Saint Bernard, with cavalry and artillery, he gives rightly enough. The Alps have to be introduced for the Apennines. The quatrain following next to this he passes sub silentio, for the reason above is assigned, though it is pregnant with meaning, and how this should have been overlooked by M. Lepelletier I cannot quite understand, but so it is. Century 2, Quatrain 30. 2:45. Un des dieux d'Hannibal infernaux fera renaître, effrayeur des humains, oncle plus d'horreur, ne plus pires journaux, qu'advint viendra par Babel aux Romains. Translation. One of whom the gods of Hannibal from the lower regions shall cause to be born again shall be a terror to mankind. Never will more horror nor more evil days come upon the Romans. The confusion will be like that before from Babel. Notes on the translation. Fera should be feront, I think. Avant I take to mean avant. Viendra for viendront. Hannibal and Napoleon are the only great generals who ever forced their military way over the Alps successfully. Hannibal with his acetum, vinegar, or hatchet, as some have interpreted Livy, and Napoleon for cavalry and heavy pieces of artillery. He seemed to be the marvelous Carthaginian born again out of the shades of Hades, a scourge and flail of men. Babel itself not worse in the confusion that fell upon Rome, and the Church of Rome through him. We have given this before at page 228, but repeat it here with further enlargement, as it belongs more to Napoleon than to the Revolution. Garancière thinks it was fulfilled when Charles V sacked Rome. If we consider, as I do, that the two stanzas are inseparable, they will fit only Napoleon. We come now to a quatrain that M. Lepelletier has overlooked, but which Boyce, page 83, with some reason, attributes to Napoleon. Century 4, Quatrain 54. Du nom qui oncle ne fut un roi gallois, jamais ne fut un foudre si craintif, tremblant l'Italie, l'Espagne et les Anglois, de femmes étrangers grandement attentifs. Translation. Of a name that never belonged to Gallic king, never was there so terrible a thunderbolt. He made Italy tremble, Spain and the English. He wooed a foreign lady with assiduity. Notes on the translation. Onc should be onc, to scan. Italie is the reading of the text type. Boyce reads Ital, and then the line will scan. Étranger was probably pronounced as of two syllables only, but it is difficult to make this line scan. Boyes introduces into his interpretation of this a good deal of foolish adulation of Napoleon, pretending that he was not only craintif towards his enemies, which we must render a cause of terror, but also that he was himself craintif, very tender of the lives of his troops. To prove this monstrous proposition, he quotes the claptrap uttered by him before the Battle of Austerlitz. Quote, "I regret to think how many of these brave fellows I shall lose. I feel for them as if veritably they were my own children. Indeed, I sometimes reproach myself for this sentiment of tenderness. I sometimes fear it may end in rendering me unfit to carry on war." Unquote. This was indeed an heroic fear, says Boyes. We are content to let its heroism wrestle with its hypocrisy. We foresee which will come by the first fall. Garancière translates that the warrior, whoever he may be, will follow after strange women, and that would fit Napoleon, though not specially. But we think it better to render it with Boyes as indicating the Empress Josephine, who was of Creole blood, and therefore foreign, or Marie-Louise, equally foreign. If the latter, Estrange would stand for Austrian. Voir Century I, Quatrain 83. Century VIII, Quatrain 53, 1-69. Dedans Boulogne voudra laver ses fautes. Il ne pourra au temple du soleil. Il volera faisant chose si haute. En hiérarchie n'en fut onc un pareil. Translation. In Boulogne he would make up for his shortcomings, but cannot penetrate the temple of the sun. He hastens away to perform the very highest things. In the hierarchy he never had an equal. Notes on the translation. Fautes to be taken as shortcomings, and C. Very. This is a singularly interesting quatrain. It has received 3 different interpretations, all 3 somewhat curious. Garancière opens the ball. He says there are 2 towns called Bolloin, one in Italy, one in France. That is Bologne in Italy and Boulogne in France. He thinks Boulogne is intended, and that Richelieu, a man of high things, and beyond the hierarchy, vowed a little before his death that if he recovered he would make a pilgrimage to Boulogne, to the Temple of Miracles there, dedicated to the Virgin, here described as the Sun, from that passage in the Revelation, quote, "And there appeared a woman clothed with the sun." Unquote. But the cardinal took the road of death, which led not through Boulogne to the shades below, and certainly not to the Temple of the Sun. This has an interest of its own, but as an interpretation is utterly wide of the mark. Richelieu on a repentant pilgrimage to the Temple of the Sun would have been admirable as a caricature in Rabelais, but would be no fitter subject for Nostradamus's pen than if a lady of title went to Aix-les-Bains to take the waters there. And observe, he had to invent a Temple of the Sun to send him to, for never was there such a temple at Boulogne. We have also Lepelletier trying his hand, and he realizes it in Louis Napoleon, in his escapade of 1840. When he was made emperor, his Italian exploit is represented as a flight to the Temple of the Sun. But how he could suppose that inferior mortal to be referred to in N'en fut onc un pareil, I cannot divine. Boyes and others attribute it to Napoleon and his intention to descend upon England from Boulogne in the flotilla. Is there not a column there ridiculously built to commemorate the failure? Is there not also a Boulogne medal struck, Ford's, Spain, 1-272, with one of the Napoleonic falsehoods, an endless series, imprinted on its face, which runs, quote, "Descente en Angleterre frappée à Londres." Unquote. These are the ridiculous touches, but now let us enter on the serious interpretation and see what that will yield us. At Boulogne, the emperor will endeavor to blot England from the map of Europe, and so redeem all his previous shortcomings in that direction. He promises himself the satisfaction of dictating his terms in London, and possibly entertained, in that strange brain of his, some dream that he would be crowned on that royalty-confirming stone of Scone in Westminster Abbey, where tradition tells the temple of Apollo was shaken down by earthquake, A.D. 154, the temple of the sun. But il ne pourra au temple du soleil, says Nostradamus, and history has thought fit in this as on many other occasions to endorse the forecast of the prophet. Boyes adds, Napoleon finira par faire la conquête de l'Angleterre. But Boyes is not Nostradamus, and Napoleon, like Richelieu, went to the shades below from St. Helena and did not go to the Temple of the Sun nor to the Stone of Scone. He went away, however, from Boulogne to very great things, as men count greatness, and was quite without an equal in the hierarchy of kings. End of chapter 23, part 2. Read by Sandra.
Section 24 of Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward. Section 24. Louis XVIII and Louis Philippe. We now come to the restoration of Louis XVIII, Prestige 38, 1-235. Roi salué, victor, impérateur, la foi faussée, le royal fait connu, sang maintien, roi fait supérateur, de gens superbe, humble, par plus venu. This is a very crabbed quatrain. Translation: the king is saluted, victor and dominator, the oath falsified. The king makes himself known again. Grandson of Louis XIV becomes king, is called back by the proud people, humiliated to tears. Louis XVIII is proclaimed king May 3rd, 1814, but the people take up Napoleon from Elba, March 1st, 1815, thus breaking faith. Louis XVIII, Le Royal, is again recognized July 8th, 1815, the grandson of Louis XIV, Sang et Maintien, a name conferred by Nostradamus on Louis XIV, who assumed the emblem of the sun, Maintien being son of Aurora, who opens the gates of the morning sun. This grandson becomes now undisputed king, the humiliated French nation recalling him with tears. Century 10, Quatrain 16, 1-236. Heureux, au règne de France, heureux de vie, ignorant, sans morferieur et rapine, par nom flatteur sera mis en vie, roi des robes trop de fois en cuisine. Translation: happy in the kingdom of France, happy in life, free from blood, violent death, and angry rapine. He will have a flattering name and be an object of desire, a king retired, with too much faith in the kitchen. Here we are to take Louis XVIII as restored to the throne of France. His life passes happily, without violent experiences of blood, death, rage, or rapine. The flattering name was given to him of Désiré, that is prophetically hinted in the words, Il sera mis en vie. He will not devote sufficient attention to his public duties, so that he may be described as dérobé, retired or retained at home, and he will be too much addicted to enjoyments of the table, trop de fois en cuisine. The gastronomy was proverbial. The obesity consequent upon it made him grow inert, so that he gradually let the affairs of state drift without giving them due attention. Century 3, Quatrain 96, 1-38. Chef de Foisson aura gorge coupée par le docteur du lemier et l'effrier, le fait patrer par ceux du mont Tarpé, Saturne en Léo 13, de février. Translation. A prince of Fasano shall have his throat cut by the keeper of his hounds and greyhounds. The attempt will be made by those of the Tarpeian Rock, Saturn being in Leo on 13th February. Fasana is put by Synecdoche for Sardinia. A prince, therefore, of Sardinia shall be stabbed by the keeper of the kennel, instigated by republicans, when Saturn is in opposition to the sign of the Lion on February the 13th, 1820. Monsieur le Pelletier, who seems somewhat learned in the houses of the stars, says that Saturn was in opposition to, and not in conjunction with, Leo on this occasion. But Nostradamus leaves it open. The Tarpeian Rock is figuratively employed to signify the mountain, or the demagogues and the republicans generally. The Mont Tarpeius was first named from murder, and was for ages a scene of murder. Tarpeia, who betrayed the capital to the Sabines, was crushed by their shields at the gate, and her father Spurius Tarpeius was thrown over the battlements by order of Romulus. Children ill-formed at birth were flung from its heights. It was better known as Capitolinus, so-called Capitoli, from the head of Ptolus found there when digging foundations for the temple of Jupiter. Thus the place of the skull, a Golgotha from the beginning of Rome. Later on, criminals were sentenced to be thrown from it. Many of these deadly associations were, no doubt, present to the mind of Nostradamus, and made this mountain of death seem to him fit to foreshadow the death that should emanate from the French mountain. To dwell upon this is of physiological interest, as showing how very closely the natures of the poet and the prophet overlap each other, so that, as in the rainbow colors, there is no line to be drawn as to where one begins or another ends. They may be seen, but not severed. The Duc de Berry was the son of Marie-Thérèse of Savoy, married to the Comte d'Artois, she being the daughter of Victor Amédée Troyes, King of Sardinia. This Sardinian was to have ruled France, and with but one intervening, to have followed the Corsican in the occupation of the throne. Louvel, the murderer, stabbed him coming from the opera, and wore the king's livery at the moment of the attempt. The forecast is again wonderful in prefiguring every particular short of the names of the two individuals. The nationalities are given, the calling of Louvel, and the day of the month. If all this be chance, some harebrained few would prefer it to what they know of certainty. Century 5, Quatrain 4, 1-240. Le gros mastin de cité de chassé sera fâché de l'étrange alliance. Après au champ avoir leur surf chassé le loup et l'ours se donneront déférence. Translation. The great mastiff chased from the city will be afflicted by the strange alliance. When the stag is driven to the fields, the wolf and bear will commence to mistrust each other. The Duc de Bordeaux is the great mastiff dethroned August the 9th, 1830, by Louis Philippe. In the dog days when the star Sirius is in opposition, Le Grand Chien, burning in the horizon, is a synonym for the Gros Mastin. The city, of course, is Paris. Charles X, who was fond of the chase, is turned from the great huntsman to the stag. The wolf is Louis Philippe, a name which lends itself to loup. The bear represents, according to Monsieur le Pelletier, la montagne in the assembly, because bears make their lair in the highest situations. We need not insist on this resemblance or characteristic pointed out by le Pelletier. There are 6 quatrains devoted by le Pelletier to the Duc de Bordeaux, the Henri V that was never to be, that royal prince whom all the princes should see to be heaven descended. But as we who are not royal have seen that nothing came of him, and that being now dead, nothing can come of him, we shall pass over the 6 quatrains in silence. The quatrains of Nostradamus lend themselves most kindly to elucidation once you find the clue, but they most persistently refuse to have a meaning read into them from without. Monsieur le Pelletier has elaborated the meaning of the 6 quatrains about Louis Philippe with so much ingenious learning that we must give the whole of them and let the reader take them at his own valuation. Century 6, Quatrain 84. Celui qu'on parte Claude ne peut régner, il fera-t-on par voie séductive que du corps, l'angle fera à régner, que contre roi fera sa perspective. Translation. He who will cause that the lame cannot reign in Paris, he will effect so much in his seductive way, that from the short to long he will attain, who has brought to bear his deception against the king. The meaning of this is that Louis Philippe d'Orléans will cause the Duc de Bordeaux to be unable to hold the reins of government in Paris. The anagrammatic substitution of Sparta for Paris is doubly ingenious, inasmuch as Lycurgus at Sparta established a double kingship so called. Of course, the office could not be that of king at all, but there was the name if not the fact, and that suffices for this prince of dexterous analogous Nostradamus. Louis Philippe will achieve this by ways of seduction, and will usurp successfully his nephew's throne. Araignée, putting himself in opposition, says Le Pelletier, to his lawful king. Faire sa perspective, he renders opposition. I do not think this is the meaning of the phrase. There is an extract from Fontenelle, I cannot refer to it in his works at present, in which he speaks of a perspective that will make an emperor or a beggar out of the same figure, according to the point of view from which you regard it. That is an optical illusion. Descartes in his L'Homme mentions the pictures placed at the end of corridors to cheat the eye agreeably, and adds l'exemple des tableaux de perspective montre combien il est facile de s'y tromper. And then there were those perspectives that Holbein and his contemporaries used to introduce into their pictures of a skull or death's head so painted that you could not quite tell what it was till you reached the right point of view, when it would suddenly contract and draw its elongated self together to a true skull by a process the reverse of foreshortening. By the word sa perspective, I conceive that Nostradamus meant that Louis Philippe brought his deception to bear against the king. Century 5, Quatrain 69, 1, 250. Plus ne sera le grand en faux sommeil, l'inquiétude viendra prendre repos, dresser phalange, d'or azur et vermille, subjuger Afrique la ranger jusqu'à os. Translation: Le Grand will pretend no longer a false sleep. His disquietude will now lull itself in security, arrange his army under gold, blue, and red, subjugate Africa, gnawing it to the very bone. Louis Philippe, now king, and so become Le Grand, says M. Le Pelletier, though as applied to the individual it looks quite like a misnomer, will now unmask his designs and take his repose in security. He will adopt the tricolour of the Revolution and complete the conquest of Algeria, Pellissier roasting the refugees in caves to the very bone. Everything but the word grand justifies the interpretation to a nicety. Century 1, Quatrain 39, 1, 251. De nuit dans l'acte le suprême estrangler pour avoir trop séjourné plan est lu par toi l'empire s'abrogé exanclé amort mettre carte et paquet neller. Translation: When France shall be dominated by 3 parties, the last of the family shall be strangled at night in bed for having lent too much to the fair Capet, put to death because the paper and packet were not read. When France is dominated by 3 alternately Orleanists, Republicans, Bonapartists, the Prince de Bourbon Condé, last of his race, shall be strangled at night in his bed for desiring to follow in the suite of the Duc de Bordeaux. A new will, duly sealed up, in favor of the Bourbon, but not read, is the cause of his death. The not read means not read by the Duc de Bordeaux, in whose favor it was drawn. The Baron de Fouché, whose interests were allied to those of Louis Philippe, defeated this by the murder. M. Le Pelletier acquits Louis Philippe of complicity in the crime, but he remarks that the interest of the Baronne was incidentally that of the king. Her crime was incited by the desire to do away with the new will, by which she would be a heavy loser. It is curious that Garon Sierre considers this quatrain to have been fulfilled in Philip II of Spain, who had his own son Don Carlos strangled in bed. The coincidence of the name Philip is singular, but the remaining 2 lines he does not attempt to interpret. Century 8, Quatrain 42, 1, 253. Par avarice, par force et violence, viendre vexer les siens, chef d'Orléans, près Sainte-Mamire, assaut et résistance, mort dans sa tente, tyran qu'il d'Orléans. Translation: By cupidity and abuse of power, force, and violence, the chief of Orleans will come to vex his own near Saint-Mamire, resistance will be made. Dead in his palace, he will ever after sleep. Avarice was always the fault of Louis Philippe. By extortion and abuse, he raised resistance at Saint-Marie, and in and near the church he forced the Republicans to submission. D'Orléans, a play upon the name, never again showed energy, but slept asleep as of death in his palace. Dans Satan. The insurrection that was quelled took place on June the 5th and the 6th, 1832. Century 9, Quatrain 89, 1-254. 7 ans sera Philippe, fortune prospère, rabat y sera des Arabes l'effort, puissant, midi perplexe, rebord affaire, jeune augmiant, abysmera sans fort. Translation: 7 years will Philip's fortune prosper well. He will defeat every effort of the Arabs. In his embarrassed middle period, all goes against the grain. Young Augmiant will overwhelm his fort. Fortune will favor Louis Philippe for the first 7 years. He will repress the Arabs, but in the middle of his reign, the Eastern question will spring up and cover him with disgrace. This culminated July the 15th, 1840. For the next 7 years, all will go against the grain, and the new republic, Jean Augmiant, will overturn his throne and his Bastille, the Paris he thought he had so strongly fortified. Garancière again introduces Philip II of Spain, and there seems to exist some analogy between these two kings. The Spaniard also was prosperous for some 7 years, and in the person of his brother, Don Juan of Austria, beat the Turks in the Battle of Lepanto. Garancière reads Barbares for Arabs. Later on he had to put his son to death and was opposed by young Augmiant, the king Henri IV of France and Navarre. Century 5, Quatrain 92, 1-255. Après le siège tenu 17 ans, 5 chargeront en tel révolu terme, puis sera lent aslu de mesme temps, qui les Romains ne sera trop conforme. Translation: after the throne has been held for 17 years, 5 shall change. When that term is run out, then at the same time one shall be elected who will not be very conformable to the wishes of the Romanists. After the reign of Louis Philippe, during 17 years, 5 of his sons lost the throne with himself, and with much manoeuvring have never been able to reapproach it. They were the Comte de Paris, representative of Chartres, Duc de Nemours, Joinville, Montpensier, and Duc d'Aumale. The election that followed was that of Louis Napoleon, whose mixed or bad policy suited neither the Revolutionary Party nor the Roman Catholics. There is nothing here but the 17 years to connect this with Louis Philippe, for the 5 who changed with the revolt would be 6 if Louis Philippe himself were counted, and he certainly ought to be. The concluding 2 lines are very vague and may or may not belong to Louis Napoleon. I merely cite it as one of the ingenuities of Monsieur le Pelletier. Here are 3 prophecies cited relating to the Duc de Chartres, which seem fairly well interpreted, and very wonderful they would be if they stood alone or related to any one whose fate was of any importance in the opening scroll of history. All the little interest of Louis Philippe is centered in himself, and therefore I omit the 3 quatrains relating to his son, not because they are not curious, if rightly interpreted, of the son, but that even supposing them to be so, the Duc de Chartres is a person and a character not deserving of serious mention in history. The gossip of a barber's shop in Nostradamus' own day would be even more interesting to any rational investigator of human affairs. End of section 24.
Section 25 of the Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Republic 1848 and Napoleon III, Section 25. Century 9, Quatrain 5, 1-61. Tiers doigt du pied au premier semblera à un nouveau monarque de bas haut, qui pise et Luc tyran occupera, du précédent corriger le défaut. Translation: the third shall be a stepping stone to the throne, to a new monarch from low position to the top. He will, as tyrant, have taken a military post in Tuscany, and will seek to correct the defects of his predecessor. Notes on the translation. Tiers pour le tiers état, the third order now claiming to govern itself. The third estate will serve as a toe of the foot to the first rank, a stepping stone to place. De bas haut for de bas en haut, elevated from a low to a higher and conspicuous position. Lucca and Pisa stand for all Tuscany, where in 1831 Louis Napoleon and Charles Bonaparte, his elder brother, had, with one cannon, served by himself and a few Italian partisans, possessed himself of Civita Castellana in the Pontifical States. The National Assembly of 1848 shall serve as a foot to Louis Napoleon to step from private life into a conspicuous position. He had in his youth been concerned in the revolution of Tuscany, and purposed correcting the defect of his predecessor. This might mean that he purposed to guide France better than Louis Philippe had done, or than in 4 years the Republic had done, or, which is most probable from his idée napoléonienne, to carry to completion the policy of his uncle, Napoleon I. I cannot think it refers to Napoleon II, Duc de Reichstadt. The entire application of the quatrain is neither very clear nor very important. The quatrain on Cavaignac, I think, is hardly made out satisfactorily, so I omit it. Century 8, Quatrain 43, 1-265. Par le décide de deux choses bastards, neveu du sang occupera le règne. Dedans lecteur seront des coups de dard. Neveu par peur pliera l'enseigne. Translation. By the fall or ruin of two bastard things, the nephew by blood will occupy the empire. In lecteur there will be deaths by arrow. The nephew will fold up his standard for very fear. Notes on the translation. Latin decidium, a word not of classical usage, signifying ruin or fall. Romance, sang, is family. Latin, regnum, empire. Lecteur is a town in France in the department of Gers. Garancière adopts the variant lectour, which he says is a town in Gascony. The word occurs again, century 7-12, and there he says it is a city of Guyenne. Lectora was the Latin name. It was a place of great strength and picturesque, but unless we can find it to be an anagram, there is nothing to connect the town in any way with the fortunes of Louis Napoleon. By the overthrow of Louis Philippe and the Republic, two bastard governments, Louis Napoleon will now succeed to the throne, a nephew by blood of Napoleon Bonaparte, and what is not generally known, he was the only one of the Bonaparte family born in the palace of the Tuileries. In battle afterwards, a lecteur, coup de dard must be taken simply as battle. The nephew will furl his standard through fear. Writing in 1866, M. Lepelletier particularly remarks that the epoch is left undetermined, and as to the enigma of lecteur, nothing can be known till the event has transpired. It may then be interpreted, he thinks, in some of the idioms known to Nostradamus, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Celtic, Languedoc, etc. He considers the standard to present a further enigma, and asks, what standard? This difficulty I do not quite recognize, the imperial standard that is adopted by him, whatever it may be. To furl a standard is to close and shut it up, so that no one will rally to it any more. It symbolizes that the cause it represents is brought to the ground finally, and that it is no longer flying. As to the word lecteur, we now know that if it is to be interpreted at all, it will have to be found in connection with Sedan, the noblest reminiscence connected with which is that it was the birthplace of that great soldier and greater man, Marshal Turenne. He may well be called La Gloire de Sedan, whilst as appropriately may Napoleon the Little be designated as Sedan de la Gloire, with that furled ensign, qu'il par peur pliera. Note: the word pliera is, of course, only an archaic transposition of pliera. The line here can in no way be made to scan, being 2 syllables or 1 whole foot short. I would suggest it be read Nepveu du sang par peur pliera l'enseigne. After much difficulty and searching, I have at last come upon 2 old maps, printed at Amsterdam by Blaeu, the one dated 1620 and the other 1650, styled Les Souverainetés de Sedan. In both of these the embattled town of Sedan is given as seated on the right bank of the river Meuse, whilst on the left bank is shown an extensive territory named Grand Torcy and Petit Torcy. In another map it is given as Torcy. These maps give no indication of the points of the compass, but from another map indicating them, the river bend on which the town is seated appears to run from east to west, and if so, Torcy lies south or southwest of Sedan. In a more modern map it appears as Le Grand Torcy, and is described as lying sur la route impériale de Mézières à Sedan. Evidently, therefore, we are entitled to place Le Torcy at Sedan. The French must determine for themselves by their military bureau whether the French camp was pitched in the meadows of Le Torcy, but nothing can alter the great fact, as now for the first time made plain, that the Nepveu du sang furled his standard forever at Sedan, or Lecteur, as the oracle gives it. Now Lecteur is the precise anagram, letter for letter, of Le Torcy, though the commoner spelling is without the second E, Le Torcy. If we are to reckon this as being a chance coincidence, my only further comment will be that such chance as this is quite as miraculous as any miracle in the world could be. As regards the words Nepveu du sang, there was a caricature very popular in France at the time of the candidature for the French presidency, consisting of 2 pictures. In one, the Prince de Joinville was commending himself to the French people for election, having the young Comte de Paris by the hand, and saying, "I am the uncle of my nephew." On the other side, Louis Napoleon presses his suit by pointing to a statuette of Napoleon Bonaparte, and uttering the words, "I am the nephew of my uncle," showing how characteristically Nepveu du sang designates Prince Louis Napoleon. He may almost be said to have chosen it himself as a cognomen. Century 8, Quatrain 44, 1, 267. Le procréé naturel d'Aumignon, de 7 à 9 du chemin d'Estournay, à roi de longue amie et au moyen, doit en avoir fort de peau prosternée. Notes. Augmion has been explained already to be the symbol of the French Republic. Ami au, instead of ami et au in the 3rd line. Maillon, Le Pelletier says, is demi-homme, a man of low birth, and roi de longue égale de vieille race. I prefer to read de longue vie and understand the King of Prussia, and my homme I take to be the bivalve man or Bismarck. I propose here to make the meaning as clear as I can without a translation. Napoleon III, le procréé, the natural offspring of the French Republic, Augmion, will turn from the right road for 7 or 9 years before his fall. Le Pelletier interprets this otherwise. He says that the war in Italy began in the 7th year of the Empire, 1869, and from that date, throughout the 9 following years, he changed his policy. I think the line means that from 7 to 9 years before the end of his reign he changed his policy. That is to say, from 7 years previous to the close of his reign, when Charles Auguste Louis, Duc de Morny, died, i.e. in 1865. And even for 2 years previously to that, things took a different turn. De Morny no longer exercised active control, and his was the head that had guided all along. When he died, all ran to destruction. The Roi de Longue and his friend Mayome Le Pelletier states to be Victor Emmanuel and Garibaldi, one of the long race and one of low birth, the tallow smelter. I think it is Frederick William, de Longue Vie, and Bismarck, the bivalve man, which it becomes if we read it as Mayome. I have a great idea that Navarre is a misprint for Le Nepveu. Whether Fort de Pau may mean with his health re-established by staying at Pau or not, I cannot say. But anyhow, I think that the last two lines are to be read together, and that he is to prostrate himself to the king and his friend. Louis Napoleon's whole reign must be represented as a failure if you read it with Le Pelletier. Mine makes it a failure during the last 7 to 9 years. My king and friend bring about the catastrophe far below the date that his will do. My emendation to Le Nepveu certainly clarifies the meaning. The explanation of Pau is not quite so comprehensible as I could wish. Had Ham been a variant, it would have spoken for itself. The Quatrain 53 of Century VIII, which I have already explained as the flotilla of Napoleon Bonaparte, M. Le Pelletier fixes as the ludicrous Boulogne expedition of Louis Napoleon, and the Italian campaign after he became emperor, but I think he entirely fails in reading the symbols. Century V, Quatrain 8, 1-70. Sera laissé feu vif, mort caché, dedans les globes horrible épouvantable. De nuit à classe, cité en poudre lâchée, la cité à feu, l'ennemi favorable. Translation: Live fire, hidden death, shall be left in bombs, a horrible and frightful thing. By a band at night the city shall be fired with powder. The city seems on fire. It helps, though intended to destroy. Notes on the translation. The Latin word classis is a band. A class is by a band. It might be better here to render classe as crash, a Greek word, brisure. De nuit la classe, a crash by night. Fulminating mercury, feu vif, in bombs, in terrible explosion, contains death hidden. The city, Paris, will be startled with powder liberated, lâché or loosed, by assassins at night. The city will seem on fire, but the enemy, in spite of himself, will prove favorable to Napoleon. This, of course, is Orsini's attempt of January 14th, 1858. The next verse follows up the thread. Century V, Quatrain 9, 1-71. Jusqu'au fond, la grande arc démolue par chef captif, l'ami anticipé. Naîtra de dames francs, face chevelue, l'or par astuce, duc à mort attrapé. Notes. Latin for arca, chest or dam. Latin demolitus, demolished. Latin antecaptus, seized beforehand. Latin dux or leader. Translation. When the peristyle is thoroughly demolished by the chief prisoner, the friend being taken before, a plot born of the woman, long beard and hairy face, then by cunning the leader caught will be executed. The peristyle, la grande arc, of the opera shall be completely shattered. Pieri, the friend of Orsini, the chief captive, is seized beforehand by Hébert, head of the detective service, who recognized him in the crowd. The plot was conceived in the secret lodges of the demagogy, de dames, whose members wear the beard and long hair. Orsini, the leader of the whole, will be surprised astutely by the confessions of Gomez at the restaurant Broggi, whither he had fled, and being taken will be sentenced to death. I do not feel very confident as to this interpretation, but give it much as I find it in M. Le Pelletier. Century V, Quatrain 10, 1-72. Un chef celtique dans le conflit blessé, auprès de caves, voyant siens morts abattre, de sang et plaies et d'ennemis pressés, et secours par inconnus de quatre. Translation. The Celtic chief is wounded in the strife, seeing death strike down his friends near the theatre, surrounded with blood and wounds, and pressed by enemies, he escapes the 4 assassins by unknown aid. Notes. Latin, unus, the first. Latin, cavea, theatre. Romance, incogneus, unknown. The 4 were Orsini, Pieri, de Rudio, and Gomez. The emperor, slightly struck in the eye by a fragment of glass, shall see his people strewn in death about the entrance of the Grand Opera. Pressed by the conspirators, 4 in number, he will receive unknown help, whether of angels or pure spirits, M. Le Pelletier cannot quite say. We now know that he had still to see Sedan, but it would be curious if pure spirits had interested themselves greatly to protect the cold-blooded murderer of the Champ de Mars and coup d'État. Century 6, Quatrain 4, 1-273. Le second chef du règne Danemark, par ceux de Frise et l'île britannique, fera dépendre plus de 100 000 marks. 20 exploité voyage en italique. The second of the Napoleonic race in power will cause England and Hanover to expend 100,000 marks in fortifications and war material. Fearing invasion after the Orsini effort, he will then exploit the Italian campaign, though vainly, as he will not reap the results he looks for. This corresponds so clearly with what happened that probably most will agree that it is a very remarkable forecast. Century 3, Quatrain 37, 1-274. Avant l'assaut, l'oraison prononcée, vilain prince d'aigle par embûche dessus, muraille antique par canon enfoncé, par feu et sang à merci peu reçu. Translation. Before assault, a harangue is pronounced. Lombardy is taken by the eagle, being cut off by ambuscade. An ancient wall driven in by cannon, fire and blood, but little mercy shown. Notes on the translation for Century 6. Frise is Hanover. The Latin word dependere, to weigh out or spend. Monsieur Le Pelletier calculates that the golden mark was equal to 250 grams, or 100,000 marks, or 10 million francs. From Century 3, Latin, oratio, harangued. Romance, prince or prix is taken. Latin, decisus, to cut off. Before the declaration of war, the emperor will pronounce, January 1st, 1859, in the presence of the diplomatic corps, a threatening discourse against Austria. Lombardy, Milan, part for the whole, will be ceded by Austria at the Treaty of Zurich, October 17, 1859. Austria, an old wall, will yield to cannon, fire, and blood. Century 5, Quatrain 20, 1-275. De là, les Alpes, grande armée passera. Un peu devant naîtra monstre vapin. Prodigieux et subit, tournera le grand Toscan à son lieu plus propin. Translation. A great army will pass beyond the Alps. A little before, a prodigious scamp will come to power. He will drive the Grand Duke of Tuscany to his nearer home with astounding suddenness. Notes on the translation. De là for au-delà, Italian vapa or scamp. Il tournera for il fera tourner. Latin propinque, at hand or near, and Latin subito, suddenly. In 1859, Napoleon III's army will pass the Alps. A little before, a prominent scamp will have come to the front, who will suddenly and in a most startling fashion drive the Grand Duke of Tuscany to seek refuge in Austria, son lieu le plus propice. We have to note here that Nostradamus, whenever he emerges from the impassibility of the secret étude, it is to exhibit a profound hostility to the genius of democracy and revolution. There is therefore little doubt but that the powerful epithet here employed of the monstre vapin relates to the red-shirted Garibaldi. We have now reached the point which covers the last of the oracles of Nostradamus that commentary has yet been able to lay before the world, with its meaning rendered transparent by the correspondence of interpretation with an event in history. The number of such correlations of occurrence with forecast falls immensely short of the number of the quatrains themselves. In fact, only about 151 out of 1,000. The rest give no scintillation as yet, but lie without sign of existence traceable, dead as a flint, till the iron stroke of time's heel shall develop the spark. Latiat scintillula forsan. 1 or 2 presages and 2 or 3 sixains have been also resolved. Enough, we trust, has been opened up to show what a treasure house it is that we have entered into, how rich in curiosity, if in nothing more. What may still lie perdu in the bulky remainder of 850, it is impossible to say, whether, though unidentified, they have been realized already, or are yet to bud in the future. If nothing more be ever done with Nostradamus than this book gives, still the work must, for one reason or other, hereafter stand out as the most wonderful book of its kind that was ever written or printed in this world. It has now to go forth and take its chance, good or evil, of notice or of neglect, amongst the mass of printed matter, largely rubbish, that deluges our life. It is certainly calculated, so far as it can secure any attention whatever, to severely shock the prejudices now prevalent amongst mankind. The half-educated will find it troublesome to read, and disturbing, perhaps, to think about, whilst the scientific may even denounce it as a locust cloud of darkness mediaeval in its tendency. Undoubtedly, it must have the effect that Nostradamus, in his preface to his son, see page 50, says very graphically it will have. Que possible fera retirer le front à quelques-uns. Although, as he says again, the forecasts may be clouded, they will be understood by men of sense, and they will grow clearer as ignorance dies out. See page 54, which should be our care now. To all objectors I rejoin, gentlemen, investigate, please, all the points in question as searchingly as you can. Find every fault in my work and in that of the other Nostradamic commentators that you can. Expose all that is weak or elusive, wherever you find it to be so. Let us see, then, how far all the learning and acuteness you can bring to bear, coupled with whatever established prejudice and its rancour at being disturbed in comfortable somnolency, can suggest to overthrow what other men heretofore, and I now, have taken so much pains to bring together and give shape to. Consciously I have not set down a single word with any other desire than that the truth should prevail, and if your criticism can establish the opposite, I shall still repeat, let truth prevail. But I do not think you can do this, and if not, there is only one other thing open to the learned and the wise that can be done. That is, to rewrite their philosophies so as to make room for the reception of this rather awkward piece of truth that has here got in the way of our old theories, and cannot be got out of the way again. To the really competent and candid reader, I have nothing whatever to add beyond begging him to refer back to the closing words of my preface, as to him they will be found to contain my whole and entire message. End of the 25th part of the Oracles of Nostradamus, read by Sandra.
Section 26 of Oracles of Nostradamus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward, Section 26, Appendix, referred to at page 178. The genuine and spurious portraits of Cromwell are numerous to such a degree that they may almost be called innumerable, for they can never be counted, as no one man can get at them all to reckon them up. Their main authority is said to depend upon the works of 4 artists: Lely, Cooper, Walker, Faithorn. Samuel Butler, the author of the ever-marvelous Hudibras, is thought to have painted a likeness, but it counts for nothing, as it is not now to be identified as existing in any collection. The first named 3 are painters. The 4th is a great engraver. In all these, Mr. Frederick Harrison professes to discover singular resemblance, Cromwell, page 32, but considers that Cooper's is the most successful of them all. I find the first to be a most misleading statement, and one that may be disproved by anybody who will compare Cooper's likeness, as given in Carlyle's Cromwell Letters, with the picture by Walker in the National Portrait Gallery. They differ in every particular, in character, feature, temperament, and conformation. Scarcely do they agree even in the wart. There is nothing to identify them as representing the same individual. Either Lely copied Cooper, or Cooper copied Lely, and they accordingly, of course, correspond with each other. But truth is too much sacrificed to flattery by both these courtly painters, for us to suppose that their work corresponds very accurately with the sitter. Such examples of Faithorn as are readily accessible in the print room at the museum convey no adequate idea of the man. Neither do they resemble Cooper, Lely, nor Walker's work. There is a profile print by Houbraken, an excellent performance, which is interesting as showing that both the chin and forehead receded greatly. There is also a very peculiar engraving of Thomas Simon's medal, which is very beautiful as a work of art. But here again the facial angle is simply villainous, with very mean diminutive eyes, and the dress almost clerical. The engraving from the Cooper at Sydney College gives the wart on the left brow instead of the right. From such discrepant things, it seems to me next to impossible to derive any correct notion regarding the face of Cromwell, except that the facial angle of the side face must have been unusually bad. Yet Mr. Harrison is able to express himself as follows, quote, "No human countenance recorded is more familiar to us than that broad, solid face, with the thick and prominent red nose, the heavy, gnarled brow, with its historic wart, eyes firm, penetrating, sad, square jaw, and close-set mouth, scanty tufts of hair on lip and chin, long loose brown locks flowing down in waves onto the shoulder, his whole air breathing energy, firmness, passion, pity, and sorrow." End quote. Carlyle's fancy version is given below. Quote, "Stands some 5 feet 10 or more, a man of strong solid stature and dignified, now partly military carriage. The expression of him valor and devout intelligence, energy and delicacy on a basis of simplicity. 54 years old, gone April last. Ruddy fair complexion, bronzed by toil and age. Light brown hair and mustache are getting streaked with gray. A figure of sufficient impressiveness, not lovely to the man-milliner species, nor pretending to be so. Massive stature, big massive head of somewhat leonine aspect, evident workshop and storehouse of a vast treasury of natural parts. Wart above the right eyebrow, nose of considerable blunt aquiline proportions, strict yet copious lips, full of all tremulous sensibilities, and also, if need were, of all fierceness and rigors. Deep loving eyes, call them grave, call them stern, looking from under those craggy brows as if in lifelong sorrow, and yet not thinking it sorrow, thinking it only labor and endeavor. On the whole, a right noble lion face and hero face. End quote. Carlyle, Cromwell Letters, Volume 2, page 435. This being derived from a falsity must itself be false. But is it not somewhat curious that friends and foes of Cromwell should alike sit down contentedly before this admirably executed miniature of Cooper's, without devoting a second thought to its representative value as a portrait of the man in question? Its artistic felicity should be as nothing to the historical inquirer. Taken as a mere portrait, this Cooper is as valueless as Veronese's presentment of Alexander the Great, or as any fancy portrait of Oliver would be if sent in by some skilled modern hand to the next May show at Burlington House. Our sense of surprise increases when we come to remember that we possess an authentic original to go by, in the shape of a mask still extant that was taken at death. Historians draw up rigmarole pen and ink portraits of their own, but are all silent about this, or make only casual mention of it as the mask at the statuaries, just as though it corresponded in every particular with Samuel Cooper's exquisite pigment figment. Romanticists delight in colored detail gathered from history, and historians revel in romance when it saves them from searching into dry detail. In this case, historical gossip slips in to illustrate the stringent veracity of Cromwell. When Lely was to take his portrait, he is said to have ordered him to be faithful in representing every blemish and defect, to paint warts and all, or he would not be paid. Lely knew what this meant, and acted accordingly. All portrait painters flatter. They must to secure a practice, but they ought to select the best aspect possible, for so far it is what it professes to be, a likeness. Now the strong point with your court painter is to throw in skillfully what is not there. In this, Lely and Cooper have succeeded to admiration. Walker, in his several portraits, gives us another set of varieties. His picture in the Portrait Gallery, Granger, Biographical History, Volume 3, page 290, with Cromwell's son Richard as page tying on the father's scarf, has been finely engraved by Pierre Lombard. In this picture, which is a little wooden, we get an average-looking gentleman going to battle, a man we should have to look at 3 or 4 times before we should individualize him at all in the memory. Mr. Nobody riding to nowhere particular is the impression derived. Of the engraving, however, Evelyn says, and he knew Cromwell perfectly well, quote, that it gives the strongest resemblance of him." End quote. He therein physiognomically discovers, quote, "characters of the greatest dissimulation, boldness, cruelty, and ambition in every stroke and touch." End quote. I can say nothing of this, for I have not seen the Lombard engraving. The picture does not convey the idea. How pliantly subservient art was in those days is well illustrated in another Cromwell engraving by the same Lombard. This artist had done, after Van Dyck, a Charles on horseback, from which he erased the face and substituted that of Cromwell. The slender figure of the king had to do duty for the heavy-built brewer of Huntingdon. But times change, and we with them. So Peter reinstated the king. There must be impressions of this turn-face print in its 3 states, for no doubt copies were sold at every stage. The king is dead, God save the protector is dead, God save the king. The dead lion is never so good for the crowd as the live ass, irrespective of the latter creature being far more representative, a quality much sought after in modern governors. There is a portrait of Cromwell affixed to Isaac Kimber's Life of Oliver Cromwell, which he published anonymously, Granger, Volume 3, page 297. This is pronounced in the Letters of Mr. Hughes to be most like the authentic family pictures of Cromwell. Vertue engraved it in 1724 for Rapin's History of England, and when Granger wrote, the picture was in the possession of Sir Thomas Frankland of Old Bond Street. I suppose this to be still in the hands of the Frankland Russells of Chequers Court, who also possess a plaster cast of Cromwell's face. By the courtesy of the family, I have been permitted to examine this, but it seems to me of no value, and it has no history. We come now to the terracotta bust by Edward Pierce, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, said to be taken from life. Pierce was an artist in the 2nd generation. His father, of the same Christian name, was a painter and assistant of Van Dyck. Our Edward was trained for a statuary, and became the pupil of Edward Bird. He also acted as assistant to Sir Christopher Wren, and is said to have built St. Clement Danes under him. He did a bust of Wren for the theatre at Oxford, and also one of Newton. He died at Surrey Street in the Strand, and was buried at the Old Savoy. This bust of Cromwell was, to all appearance, modelled by him from a cast taken from life, and must therefore, as to measurement and bulk, be of life size. I was kindly permitted by Mr. George Scharf of the National Portrait Gallery to take the dimensions of this bust by measurement, but practically they are not very useful, inasmuch as the head has a great abundance of short curly hair, which of course in terracotta becomes perfectly solid, and thereby increases the circumference of the head by many inches. The circumference, hair and all, at his brow is 28 2/8 inches. Nape of neck to frontal bone, where it unites with nose, 15 4/8 inches. Breadth from ear to ear, at level of the central hole of each ear, as near as can be approximated, 6 2/8 inches. This last measurement is, I believe, correct, but it is a dimension that only a large forceps could take with perfect certainty. It is so small, however, that I feel sure that the other two dimensions must be very far from giving the true osseous formation, so that several inches will have to be allowed off them for the hair. Again, the measurement between the tip of nose and back of head, 9 5/8 inches, would also require that deductions be made for a wad of hair at the back. This measurement, when reduced, and coupled with the third measurement given, indicates an undersized skull for a broad-built man of 5 feet 11 in stature. As for the physiognomy, the nose, though far from fine, is somewhat aquiline, and the best of all the features of the face. The forehead is low, ill-formed, and mean. The mouth firm, cruel, deceitful. The jowl and chin sensual and gross, almost to brutality. It is the face of a man of low passions, possibly ambitious, but of great duplicity, of a low-bred type, the type as of one sprung from a lower stratum of society than his history indicates him to have sprung from. And you may readily suppose that in exchanges of coarse buffoonery with the roughest trooper of his corps, he would have been quite within his own province and at home. His mother's portrait shows her also to have been a very masculine, coarse-featured woman. It is well perhaps to mention here a bust that Gross, in a letter to Granger in 1774, calls a masterly and spirited bust of Oliver Cromwell by one Bonnier. It was then in Mr. Gosling's collection. He says it is like that engraving given in Rapin's History. I imagine it, therefore, to be a fancy rendering and of very small historic value. The expert historians, and of course the general public together with them, are perfectly satisfied with the Cromwell presented to them by Samuel Cooper. I confess that I think it a most laughable presentment, and of quite impossible credence. I do not think Pierce's bust to be satisfactory, but I most certainly consider that it is the only likeness I have had the opportunity of examining that conveys even a hint of what can be supposed to be the real appearance of the man. There is but one way now remaining to settle this question. It is very much to be regretted that, with so much pretense of a desire for historical accuracy, we should have allowed 250 years to elapse without making the least attempt to settle this question. We learn from Breval's Travels that at the old palace at Florence there is a cast preserved of Oliver Cromwell. The mold was obtained from Cromwell's face a few minutes after his decease, through the dexterous management of the Tuscan resident in London. This, or a cast from it, ought immediately to be secured for our National Portrait Gallery. A copy of it would cost very little in either time, money, or trouble to secure, and when secured, 3 or 4 should be cast in bronze and placed in different museums so that one fire could not destroy all of them at once. I feel almost sure that it will be found to confirm the bust of Pierce as being more like Cromwell than anything else that we possess. And further, as Pierce's work is by no means a grand achievement in the sculptor's art, I should hope to find in the Florence cast characteristic indications that are absent from Pierce's work. Grandeur of soul is incompatible with such a face as Pierce gives us, but I confess that I see no grandeur whatever that could be expressed by a man whose history is that of Oliver. His base success the world may worship if it will. I despise success if it must be obtained by Cromwell's methods. I observe that the great in history are always mean in fact, and I well know that you must say to all the men who have been triumphant, let no probing moralist come near you. Pitiable and contemptible is the man who can envy the great in the greatness of their crimes. I do not expect that the cast, if procured, will make the reading any better for Cromwell, but if it should, I am quite ready to give him all the advantage of it. At present, I hold that the face is villainous like the man. Quote, Duciter unco spectandus, gaudent omnes, quae labra, quis illi vultus erat, nunquam, si quid mihi credis, amavi hunc hominem. End quote. Juvenal, Satire 10, 66. Still, love or no love, we have reached the end, and if we should confirm Pierce, the flesh and bones of the man thus revived will also confirm the epithets of Nostradamus, which first induced me to enter upon this investigation. End of section 26, Appendix. End of Oracles of Nostradamus by Charles A. Ward.